Hello, this is Mrs. Polisky, and these are notes for World History, Chapter 16, Section 4, the Atlantic Slave Trade. Make sure that you have your packet so that you can complete the notes as we go along. So here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about slavery and where it originated and how it kind of prospered over the years, and also some of the obviously the horrifying downsides of slavery as well. So, to begin with, for the most part, slavery and slave trade began along the triangular route that connects traders in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And the other day in class, we were talking a little bit about this. You know, out of Africa came slaves, and they ended up here in the New World. Along with that, in the New World, they were able to provide the labor for growing crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then shipped to Europe. And in Europe, those items would be manufactured into textiles, perhaps maybe rum or other products. And then those items would be shipped to Africa, okay, and other parts of the world, okay, to trade the slaves for for other products. We saw an exchange of textiles for peoples or guns for peoples. So, uh, slavery for the most part was not exclusively introduced by Europeans. If you date back before the beginning of what is kind of called the slave trade period, you would find that Africans, in their tribal communities would take prisoners after battles, and those prisoners would be sold or traded back to their own peoples. Europeans, many of them were eager to trade guns for people. The Americas were still developing. African mines and plantations needed labor as well. Some of those mines and plantations were operated by Europeans. And in the New World, there was a problem with disease. Europeans had exposed Native Americans to smallpox and other diseases which they had no immunity for. And we needed a group of workers who had some immunity to that could provide the labor. So becoming a slave and how you get out of slavery. Well, slavery, becoming a slave could be because of warfare, heredity, because of a raiding debt that one tribe had to the other, or you could sell oneself off as a volunteer, meaning that you freely chose to provide yourself as labor, and perhaps maybe even criminal punishment. Individuals who were in slavery might be able to get out of it due to time. If they had spent a considerable amount of time, they might have been able to pay their debt in that regard and then be released. Marriage was a possibility. Military success, meaning that if there was a campaign and people were liberated, you could go free, or if a debt was paid off. European slave traders. The European slave trade was at its height between the 1500s and 1800s. Portuguese, French, Belgians, and the English were involved in this. Some of this was for the desire for land, which we'll talk a little bit more about in Chapter 25, Section 3, and for gold. Merchants went inland very rarely because of disease. They were very fearful, as well as from disease, some of the things that could be in the environment, such as animals, or just the fear of the unknown. Countries wouldn't give money for any further exploration, so Europeans traded guns with African merchants. Companies could only buy and sell slaves as a result of that. The Middle Passage. Approximately 11 to 50 million slaves went to the Americas. Okay, now it's really hard to pinpoint the number. Part of that is the fact that the record keeping was not necessarily the best. But, some of those slaves were lost in transit, meaning that because of illness, they might have been thrown overboard during the passage. Perhaps it could have been because of problems with discipline. If they were being rebellious, then they might have been thrown overboard as well. So we really don't have a full number. There was also a high cost for transporting the slaves because you needed translators, food, firewood, all those amenities. Many of the slaves that were captured were torn from their families, and that's probably one of the greatest horrors of this. The fact that families were ripped apart, children ripped from their mother's grip, wives and husbands separated, never to see each other again. So it really damaged the family unit. Some were marched to ships right after battles. Many slaves were branded to mark them and chained together in hot ship holds. If you take a look, this is kind of a mock-up of what maybe a slave ship would have looked like during this era. And you can see how tightly packed these individuals are. Um, if individuals were sick, it would be very easy to spread contagious diseases and such. So it's really an uncomfortable journey. By the 1800s, Great Britain and the United States passed laws making slavery illegal. Now, I mentioned the other day in class the year 1808 for the United States. That was important because to ratify the U.S. Constitution, states had agreed to set the year of 1808 as the last year to import slaves outside of the United States. Okay, so it would be illegal at that point to go elsewhere to get slaves, but it didn't necessarily mean it was illegal to own slaves until after the American Civil War. All right, problems with the slave trade and some of the consequences. All right, slave hunters, battles, raids, hostility of groups, families were all torn apart. You had a depopulation of parts of Africa, basically leaving behind only the elderly and the sick, which really hurt um, many of these small nations. European and American consequences of slavery. A lot of slavery remained on the coast of Africa. Um, Little new of African culture here in the United States. As a matter of fact, it's taken years to even add African studies to many universities' curriculums. And finally, prejudice. We are still living with the consequences of that, and I don't know if how our nation will move beyond that at the present time. So, thank you very much. In our next section, we will take a look at the explorers and imperialism.